Good morning and welcome everyone. If you could please take your seats, we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome back to the public meeting, day number 2. I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items as everyone's getting settled. So as a reminder, this meeting is being webcast live. So please note that this is a public meeting. It's being recorded to video. And if you're publicly speaking in the auditorium today, you will be part of those recordings. There is no expectation of privacy. The video recording, the presentations, and the transcript of the meeting will be posted on the FSIS website shortly after the conclusion of the meeting. Wings 4 and Wings 5 in the building have restrooms for your convenience, and please note that food and drink are not permitted here in the Jefferson Auditorium. So to open the meeting today, I'd like to introduce Paul Kicker. He's the Acting Administrator of FSIS in the U.S. Department of Agriculture.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Paul Kicker, and I'm the Acting Administrator for the Food Safety Inspection Service. I want to thank everyone for being here today, and also thank those that are participating on the web as well. I also want to thank Food and Drug Administration for working together with us on this meeting. So yesterday, we heard a lot about the regulatory framework that's in place, and we heard concerns that people were bringing up that pertain to that. Today, our focus is not going to be specific to food safety, but it's going to focus more on labeling of these products to make sure that the products are identified according to customer expectations, and so that the products are labeled and don't come up with any type of advantage or disadvantage to those that are either producing this product or other products that would be in competition with them. So with that, I just want to invite everyone to really participate today and make your comments known. Yesterday was a little bit slow at times. Today we hope to keep things moving along a little bit. If we get done a little bit sooner than expected, that's fine, but we want to make sure that everyone has the opportunity to make their comments known today. So with that, I want to turn it over to Susan Maine with the Food and Drug Administration. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. As you heard, my name is Susan Maine. I direct FDA Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition. You heard a lot yesterday about potential safety hazards of foods and products created using cell culture technology, what comparators to use in interpreting those potential safety hazards, and potential strategies for addressing them. Today focuses on another important part of our mission, which is ensuring that food products are truthfully labeled and are not misleading. This is essential for giving consumers the confidence in products developed using new technologies. It enables consumers to make informed decisions about their diet and what they feed their families. My colleagues, Dr. Douglas Valentine, who directs FDA's Office of Nutrition and Food Labeling, and Malcolm Bertoni, our Associate Commissioner for Planning, will be joining the conversation today about the labeling issues associated with the development of animal cell-cultured food products. We need to be looking at how technology and transparency can go together. This is a theme we hear repeatedly. Consumers are increasingly interested in the foods they eat and want transparent labeling. As we think about labeling of these products, what information do consumers need for transparency? We also heard about the desire for labeling that can ensure that consumers who have food allergies can identify the source of products to which they might be allergic. At both FDA and USDA, improper labeling for allergens is the leading cause of food recalls. Here we have an opportunity to hear about things we may not have considered from such a diverse group of stakeholders, and to do this right in advance of products coming to the market. Public dialogue like this is crucial to openly address both the opportunities and challenges in being transparent that are presented by emerging food technologies, such as animal cell-cultured foods. In the Nutrition Innovation Strategy announced by Commissioner Gottlieb in March, we committed to exploring how to make ingredient information on food labels easier to understand. As the food supply becomes more innovative and diverse, it's even more important that we look at how we label foods. One thing we want to hear about is how much consumers understand now about food products produced by animal cell culture technology. Do they understand the nature of the technology? Do they have a perception as to whether it is more or less healthful or nutritious than traditionally bred animals, poultry, and fish? What essential elements do consumers need on a food label for cell-cultured food products to truly understand what they are getting? Should the labeling address how the product is made? Would such labeling give the consumer the impression that the cell-cultured product is equivalent to or significantly different from traditionally bred animals, poultry, and fish? And when we consider appropriate labeling, how much should nutritional composition of these foods be a consideration in labeling? How would specific label terms affect how consumers perceive the nutritional value of these products? As you will hear today, USDA and FDA work closely together on labeling and food safety issues. Where appropriate, we harmonize label elements for consumer clarity. So we are seeking your input today as to how labeling can be most transparent and truthful and not misleading when it comes to these innovative products. We look forward to hearing your thoughts about labeling considerations to ensure that consumers have the information they need, whether it be for nutrition or for safety, for example, with regard to allergens, when foods produced from animal cell culture technology come to the marketplace. And you will hear more about this today from our experts in FDA and FSIS. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kicker and Dr. Maine. So I'm going to get started with session 5. If you're following along in the agenda, we're going to talk about the regulatory frameworks for food labeling, the mandatory elements. So Dr. Douglas Valentine, the director of the Office of Nutrition and Food Labeling at the FDA's office, CFSAN, is going to begin with his overview of regulatory frameworks for mandatory labeling elements. Following that, Mr. Jeffrey Canavan, the Deputy Director in the Office of Policy and Program Development, Labeling and Program Delivery Staff at FSIS, will give his presentation. Dr. Valentine?
Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure on behalf of the Food and Drug Administration to be here this morning and to share with you the regulations that we have in place that govern our food labeling. I think you'll find that we work quite closely with FSIS. I mean, Geoff and I have worked together on food labeling and codex. Our teams talk to one another on a regular basis. So I think you'll hear what FDA does and you'll hear what USDA does, and you'll see that there's quite a lot of alignment for the most part between our approaches to labeling. So I think by the time you hear us both, you'll have a good picture on how the labeling rules that are in place might be applied to products produced from cell culture technology. There it goes. All right. Food labeling regulations have been around for a long time. It started in 1906 with the Pure Foods and Drug Act. It was amended in 1938 where it was renamed the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, which we still use today. And that act is the primary law that we follow still today that governs labeling and packaging of food products. And as Dr. Maine has said, one of the overriding principles around labeling is providing information to consumers that is truthful and not misleading, and to make it clear to consumers what the foods that they're getting are, what's in them, how much is in them, what the nutritional composition of those, what the ingredients are. So I will go over how those come together. Whoops, let's see. Somehow that doesn't look like the right one. Where is it here? Maybe go back one. That one shouldn't be where it is. There we go. That's cool. Let's see here. Maybe go back one more. Actually, this looks like my presentation for this afternoon, so. While they find some slides, I can continue a little bit along to keep us moving. So there's some other regulations in place that govern our food labeling regulations. There's the Food Additives Amendment that was added in 1958 that governed the regulatory structure for allowing food additives in food. We had the Nutrition, Education, and Labeling Act of 1990 that really put into place many of the nutrition facts labeling requirements and a number of the other nutrient content claim requirements. There's the FDA Modernization Act of 1997 that governed additional labeling requirements. And finally, there was FALPA in 2004, which really put the requirements in place around allergens in foods. And that put the mandatory labeling of the big 8 allergens in place. So those are some of the main regulations that you can find online that govern labeling of food products. There's some other regulations as well that govern food products. There's the Fair Packaging and Labeling Act, which put in place the requirements for net content statements so that consumers could accurately compare one product to another product in terms of knowing that they can know how much the weight is, they compare price, they can compare value. So that assured that consumers had an idea of what was in products. And then there's a number of other food labeling regulations that can be found in 21 CFR Part 101. And then CFSAN issues a food labeling guide to help companies wade their way through many of these regulations in more consumer-friendly terms, and we issue a number of food policy guides that govern food labeling. So those are really the laws and the regulations that we use to guide our compliance work in terms of food labeling. And one of the things that is a difference between FSIS and FDA is we do not do pre-market approval of food labels. We do approval, or we look for food labels for compliance based on our inspection post-market. We're gonna. I think they'll find it. So while they go on, just to be clear what constitutes labeling. So from an FDA point of view, labeling is all the written material that appears on a package, both the principal display panel and the other display panels of a package. So any wrapper or packaging material. It also can go to accompanying material, so shelf talkers or shelf tags that might be put adjacent to a product in a grocery store can be considered labeling. And when a company website is put on the package, material that is then linked to the web content is also considered in many instances to be an extension of labeling of that food package. So in terms of modern technology, where we have a lot of e-commerce, we have a lot of information available out on websites, labeling can be considered to be quite broad in terms of the information that might be considered web labeling as part of a food product. So when we think about labeling, FDA regulates foods and beverages that you find in most grocery stores. We regulate food if it contains less than 2 to 3% meat. Otherwise, USDA regulates those products that contain meat. So it does create some confusion. So, for example, FDA would regulate a cheese pizza, whereas USDA will regulate a pepperoni pizza. So there are some differences on which one of our organizations would regulate the product depending upon how much meat or poultry or fish would be in those products. We also regulate labeling of seafood and game meats. For some products, such as catfish, which you heard yesterday, we share jurisdiction with USDA, where USDA is now doing the inspection part of catfish, but we still regulate a certain amount of the labeling of those particular products. And as I said before, we do not pre-approve labels, but we view labels as part of inspections. So as our inspectors go out and do safety and inspections around the various factories that you heard about yesterday from Doug Stern and others, we will look at the labeling materials and we will determine whether or not the labeling of those particular products being manufactured is in compliance with the labeling regulations. So we do have quite a bit of compliance activity that we do to make sure that labeling is accurate and consistent with our regulations. And so one of the roles we have in terms of labeling is education and in these great electronic worlds, we still can't get one file from one place to the other, can we? So we do issue guidance documents and a variety of regulations and compliance guides to make it clear what the labeling regulations are and how they might apply to various food products, particularly as we are seeing an emergence of many new and novel food products that are being put into place, particularly because of either consumer preference or new ways of production or new ways of manufacturing. So an example of that would be is using cell-based technology. We also work internationally on food labeling through Codex Alimentarius, where we participate in the Food Labeling Committee in addition to the Nutrition Committee. So that helps us also guide food labeling for international commerce, so we can assure effective trade with partners around the world. So that's another element that we work, and we work quite closely in those areas with USDA as well. Not going to get there? No, I can just keep going. That's fine. Geoff has slides, and he has a lot of pretty pictures that will basically show you what I'm talking about, so we'll just keep going. It'll be fine. So when it comes to food labels that FDA regulates, there are a number of elements that are required mandatory, and then there's another group of elements that are considered to be optional or voluntary. So the mandatory elements, and it came up yesterday, one of the most important ones is really the regulatory name that a product must carry. We call that the statement of identity, and I'll spend a little bit more time a little later in my talk talking about statement of identity. But statement of identity is really the regulatory name that a product must carry so that a consumer knows what that product is. There must be a statement of quantity of contents, and that needs to be present in both pounds or ounces, but also in metric. That determines the amount of material in a product. There must be an ingredients statement on the product that captures the ingredients found there. They're listed in the order of descending amounts, and they must be listed in either in a regulatory name or the common and usual name of the product. The ingredient statement would not contain, for example, an incidental additive or certain process aids, for example, as they aren't ultimately ingredients in the final product. Unless exempt, It must also contain the name and the address of the manufacturer or the co-packer or the importer if it's a product coming in from outside of the United States. The information must have a street address so that that consumers or FDA can contact that manufacturer, and it would be considered not an acceptable label if that information is not on the product. It must have nutrition information. There are a few examples where they're exempt, but for the most part, it must have nutrition information. As I said earlier with FALPA, if it contains any of the Big 8 declared allergens, it must disclose the presence of those allergens on the food package. And it must have information that would disclose other material facts that might be related to the safety of a product, and I'll come to that in a little bit later. And there's a number of voluntary elements on the food label, all of which must be truthful and not misleading, and that could be a variety of claims, which we'll talk about this afternoon, or other information that a manufacturer would think might be important to providing transparency to the consumer about the particular product that's being sold. So I'll come back to going over the required elements in a little bit more detail and then spend a little bit more time on the statement of identity. So the statement of identity, as I said before, is really the regulatory name of the product. The statement of identity is oftentimes, if there is a standard specified in the standard of identity of a product that has been established in regulation. Other examples are common and usual names. So oftentimes a product that's used over a long period of time has a common and usual name. I mean, an example is honey, for example. Doesn't have a standard of identity, or maple syrup, but over time people know what honey is and they know what maple syrup is. If there isn't a common and usual name that has been arrived at over time, then there must be a statement of identity that could be a simple term, if that was sufficient, or it might be a statement that better describes what a particular product may or may not be. And oftentimes, sometimes a fanciful name might arise as equivalent to a common and usual name. So for example, two examples might be vanilla wafers is a short but descriptive term for what a vanilla wafer might be. And sometimes brands become synonymous with a particular food. For example, most people know what an Oreo is, and you don't need any further description to determine what that particular product is if it's a traditional Oreo. There must be a net quantity of contents, as I said before, that must be in inch pounds or in metric. And you're not allowed to quantify that further, like large or jumbo, although large or jumbo might appear someplace else on the package. And as I said, there must be an ingredient list. So let's see. So now we'll come to the nutrition facts label. As many of you know, we've just recently modernized and updated the nutrition facts label. It was updated in May 27th of 2016, where we issued the final rule. We have recently updated the compliance date from July 26, 2018 to January 1st, 2020 for large manufacturers and January 1st, 2021 for small manufacturers. You'll start to see those labels appear in the marketplace now. Quite a few labels have already been updated. I was going to show you some pretty pictures on what the old label and the new label look like, but what you'll see is that the basic iconic form of the label was retained, but serving size and calorie information was bold and made larger, particularly with the need to make sure consumers understood how many calories were in a food product and what the serving size for that particular food was. Particularly, we thought that was important to address the obesity crisis that continues to grow in the United States. Some of the other changes we made is we've now required the addition of added sugars to the label, as the intake of added sugars results in nutrient dilution and makes it difficult for consumers to get the nutrition they need within their calorie needs. So we've added that. We've changed some of the requirements in terms of the mandatory nutrients that are required in labeling. So now vitamin D and potassium are two nutrients that are required, whereas vitamin C and vitamin A are no longer mandatory elements of the label because they are no longer a public health concern. So we've made some additions to that. The other update is the quantity of vitamins and minerals that they're expressed are not only expressed as percentage of the DV, which is what they were historically, but also have milligram amounts. So those are some of the changes we've made to the label. We've also made some changing in terms of the serving size rule. So when a product is up to 300% of the serving size, or the rack as we call it, you must have dual column labeling because those particular products could easily be consumed in one eating occasion, and we wanted to assure that consumers not only knew what the nutrition information was per serving, but also the nutrition information per package. And we made some other changes in terms of large products that might be consumed in single servings. So for example, up to a 20-ounce bottle of a beverage will be considered a single serve and must be listed as a single serve. So when you look at the nutrition information there, you'll see the calorie information and the nutrition of that whole package. Again, making sure that consumers have the information they need to be aware of what they do if they consume that package as one whole container. I've already talked about food allergens, and just to acknowledge that the major food allergens are milk, egg, fish, crustacean, shellfish, tree nuts, wheat, peanuts, and soybeans. So those are the main food allergens. As we see technology emerging, for example, we discussed it yesterday in terms of cell-based technologies, where the same proteins that we would expect to be allergens in traditional agriculture, we would expect to be present in cell-based agriculture, so we'll need to consider allergy labeling. So we're seeing a number of changes related to food manufacturing and allergen labeling that need to be taken into account. And the other thing that if there's material facts that are important, particularly from a safety perspective, we expect that to be on the label. So for example, you can buy psyllium husks that are ground up to use as a source of dietary fiber. If they're not dissolved appropriately, they can create choking hazards, so there's a warning statement to avoid choking hazards. There's another example is low-fat vegetable oil-based spreads are not suitable for frying, and there needs to be a warning label on the package or an advisory label on the package to just say not suitable for frying, because the water content of those low-fat products leads to extreme spattering, which creates a health hazard. So that's the type of information that we would also require on a labeling as part of material of fact. So I'll come back quickly to statement of identity one more time, just because that's really the key regulation that involves the naming of products. And just to reiterate that those are the types of, that's the regulation which is not easily understood, but really applies to what would be the appropriate regulatory name and the name that would assure that a consumer understands what a product is and what a product is not. Let me just see whether there's anything here that would add to what I've already said. So what we would say is the general principles that we use for determining naming of products is the name sufficient to describe the basic nature of the food? Do people know what it is and what its intended use is? Dr. Maine brought it up this morning. Is the name of the food sufficient to determine whether or not a particular food has a different nutritional content? So, for example, would you need to name a product that is simply a source of protein or a vegetable-based protein but doesn't have a lot of other nutrients, simply to reiterate protein content or a protein-type food, whereas products that are more complete in nutrition that would would be used as part of, for example, dietary guidelines food group intake, you'd want to see labeled in a different way so that a consumer would really know how those particular products, not only in the naming, but also in terms of nutritional composition, fit into their diet patterns to assure that consumers know the appropriate use of those particular products within their dietary context. Another aspect of common and unusual names might have to do with percent characterizing ingredients. So, something that is 50% or more of a particular ingredient, or an oil or something like that, would characterize it as one source of it, whereas something that is less than 50% of another ingredient would characterize it as something else. So, for example, what you might see in the marketplace is there's now a lot of products out there that are blends of butter and vegetable oils to make them healthy. So if the butter content is 50% or higher, then butter would be the characterizing ingredient in that particular food. Whereas if the oil was, let's say, a canola-based spread was 50 or 51%, then the canola oil makes the dominant part of the label, and that would be the characterizing ingredient that would be used in determining the name. So characterizing ingredients and the predominant ingredients do take a role in naming of these particular products. So we have a number of general principles that we've applied that you can see in the CFR that you can be referred to that looks at how we go through in determining appropriate naming of particular products. And we would apply these particular rules to any new products that are appearing in the marketplace. So I think that more or less wraps up what I wanted to share with you this morning. I've shared with you the mandatory elements that need to be on food labels, and some of the voluntary elements that are required on food labels, and some of the principles around naming of particular foods. These are the regulatory frameworks that we would use toward thinking about how you might label and name products that would be emerging from cell-based technology, for example. So thank you for your time.
Thank you, and good morning. I'd like to emphasize that, reiterate what Doug mentioned, FDA and USDA have a very long history of working closely together, and I think we'll see as we talk the discussions today about the mandatory elements, regulatory and guideline development, consistency across all food categories is an important consideration as we develop regulations and other policies. And so I'd like to start off today's discussion with talking a little bit about the principal display panel. It's similar to FDA's definition. It's the part of the label that is most likely to be displayed, presented, or shown, or examined under customary conditions of display. And so looking at the picture here on the slide, FSIs would consider the front of these packages as they're displayed in the retail case, the principal display panel. And so FSIS does have specific requirements for certain mandatory features to appear on the principal display panel, and those include the product name that we'll talk a little bit more depth about, inspection legend, the USDA mark, the handling statement, and also the net weight statement in some cases. So here's just an example of a principal display panel. If you could see this product displayed in a retail case at your local grocery store, it has the required features there, the USDA mark in the lower left-hand corner, net weight, handling statement, and a product name. So as Doug was mentioning, there's quite a bit involved in the identity, the naming of a product. There's many factors that come into play. One would be if there's a standardized name. There's standardized names in the regulations and also in informal policy standards as well. So for example, FSIS has a standard of identity for a Frankfurter or a hot dog. It's pretty specific to fat limitations or combination of fat and water limitations, limitations on the certain use of ingredients. And others regulatory standards can be a little bit less prescriptive. And for example, a beef stew, really the identity just specifies the minimum meat requirement, which in the case of a beef stew is 25%. Ground beef is one that's a little bit more prescriptive. It is very, I should say, limiting in a sense. It has a maximum fat requirement of 30%. It actually prohibits certain ingredients such as water, binders, extenders, and phosphates. So really, you're limited to dry condimental seasonings that can be added to ground beef. In the absence of a standardized name, the next tier would be, is there a common or usual name that would apply? And so a beef ribeye steak, you'll see that's commonly used in the marketplace, referenced in various publications as a common or usual name that consumers are familiar with for a particular cut of meat. And so that would be an acceptable product name. Cheese quesadilla, pepperoni pizza would also be an example. We don't have regulatory definitions, or I should say standards of identity for these products, but they are considered acceptable common or usual names. There's also products in the marketplace that have a descriptive name in the absence of a common or usual name. These could be a unique blend of various ingredients, some meat and poultry and some ingredients under FDA as well. And so I think a good example would be some type of mixture of chicken and vegetables with cheese and a pastry. It doesn't necessarily have a common or usual name or a standardized name, but it accurately describes the characterizing components of that product. And then sometimes we also have what's called a non-specific name, and this would be one that really can't stand alone as a product identity. It doesn't give the consumer enough information on the characterizing ingredients of that product. It's not specific to the species of meat or kind of poultry that is used. And so an example would be a chuck wagon patty, and so we would expect that would be followed immediately by the ingredient statement or possibly followed by a descriptive name. So here's an example of a chicken nugget product, whole grain breaded, shaped chicken breast with rib meat patties. The next FSIS requirement is a handling statement, and this would be where a product requires special handling to maintain its wholesomeness. Typically, you'd see keep refrigerated or keep frozen. There are certain situations where a product is distributed in commerce in a frozen state and then thawed prior to retail sale and sold in a refrigerated state, and that would have the last example of the handling statement there about previously handled frozen. And there's an example of the handling statement of keep frozen. The net weight statement, it is required for all products sold at retail. There are some caveats to the net weight. For random weight consumer size packages, the net weight can be applied prior to retail sale. It does not have to be applied by the federal establishment. And there are certain exemptions, for example, products that are going to hotel restaurants and similar institutions. And there's an example of a net weight of 5 pounds. The USDA mark of inspection is one feature that's unique to FSIS regulated products. Every establishment that has a grant of inspection has a unique number associated with that establishment. And so the mark of inspection that's applied, there's two marks. We're talking about meat or poultry. The one on the left there is for meat, and the other is for the poultry. And the establishment number is required to be displayed. It doesn't have to be in the mark of inspection. It can, but it can be placed elsewhere on the package. And that helps identify the product in commerce if there's a need, say in the event of a voluntary recall or some type of other market withdrawal. And so there would be an example of the poultry mark of inspection on this poultry product. Now, the information panel is a particular location on the package other than the principal display panel. A lot of times it's not feasible to put all the required features on the principal display panel, and also it's not a regulatory requirement. So there are certain features such as the ingredient statement, nutrition facts panel, and signature line or address line, the name and address of the packer, that can appear on the information panel. And one requirement in our regulations is for when those features are presented on the information panel, they have to be presented together in a contiguous manner. And you can see this example where the nutrition's off to the left and the ingredients in the address line are to the right, but they're all placed together. Now, a very important labeling feature is the ingredient statement, and it's required when there's 2 or more ingredients are used to make a product. FSIS's regulations, we also have guidance available that further clarify ingredient labeling requirements. Going back to the regulation for a moment, there is a requirement that all ingredients be listed in descending order of predominance. course, with labeling, there are exceptions. One would be for ingredients that are added that are considered minor in nature. There's provisions for listing them in any order, provided it's prefaced with a statement such as contains 2% or less of the following, and then those ingredients can be placed in any order. We also have, I mentioned guidance, particularly clarifying some ingredient labeling requirements. We work very closely with FDA in the joint FDA and FSIS ingredient approval process, but oftentimes we get questions, for example, how flavoring should be labeled. Spices such as black pepper and white pepper and red pepper can be listed by common or usual name, but they can also, under our regulations, be listed as spice or flavoring. That's not such the case with ingredients of animal origin. So if a hydrolyzed beef protein may be used for flavoring, but we require the species of livestock or the kind of poultry to be declared. So you couldn't label that as flavoring, it'd have to be labeled as hydrolyzed beef protein. And there's an example of an ingredient statement. Won't spend a whole lot of time on this. It's the name and address of the manufacturer. If it's the name of the establishment, the federal establishment on the grant of inspection, it can just be the name, and then also the city, state, and zip when listed in the phone directory. It can identify the name of the company that the establishment is producing it for. Maybe it's a particular grocery store chain, for example, but in that case, it would have to be prefaced with a term such as distributed by or manufactured for to indicate that it's the name and address of that entity as opposed to the manufacturer. And there's an example of the address line. Nutrition facts, we have regulations in place. It's required for most products. Again, with labeling, there are certain exemptions. One would be small business exemptions or products for hotels, restaurants, institutions that, they're not intended for retail, products for further processing. Now, an important part of these exemptions, though, is that the label cannot bear any nutrition information or claims. That would kick it out of the exemption and then require nutrition facts information. So there's an example. The safe handling instructions is one feature that's unique to meat and poultry products, and it's also unique compared to other labeling features, and they can appear anywhere on the label. So it can be on the information panel, the principal display panel, front riser panel, and it needs to be on any meat or poultry product that's not ready to eat. So raw meat, the ribeye steak, for example, would have safe handling instructions on it, and it provides consumers additional information on how to handle the product to prevent cross-contamination, cook thoroughly, and also how to properly handle leftovers. And so there are exemptions, for example, products going for further processing at another establishment. Consumers would not see these products. And there are requirements for how it needs to be displayed, such as in one color. Finally, with the required labeling features for products that are imported into the United States, they have to identify the country of origin underneath the product identity on the immediate container. So here's an example of a product of Denmark under a canned ham product name. So here's just an example of a label for ground beef where all of the labeling features, I should say, are on the principal display panel. The follow is an example where they're split, and you can see that the required features, the mark, the name, net weight, handling statement are the PDP, the rest are on the information panel, and that would be in compliance with FSIS regulations. And as mentioned yesterday, and Doug mentioned this morning, FSIS does implement a prior label approval program, and this is, we draw our authority to regulate meat products from the Federal Meat Inspection Act, and there actually is language in the FMIA, as you can see in the second bullet here, where it talks about labeling in containers which are not false or misleading and which are approved by the secretary or permitted. And so USDA has always interpreted that statutory language as mandating pre-approval of all labels prior to their use in commerce offered for sale. Now we've established, based on that authority, we've established regulations related to the prior label approval system, which we'll talk about here in a moment, and then also about other labeling requirements. They They tie back to the misbranding provisions of the Act. We have certain other types of labeling requirements, such as product name qualifiers that are in regulations that we've conducted rulemaking for. And it's all related to making sure that the consumer has the appropriate information at the time of purchase to make an informed purchasing decision, and also to make sure that that label is truthful, accurate, and not misleading. So I will talk a little bit about the types of label approval and types of labels that you'll see on products. Generic labeling, we talked about how all labels are approved by the agency. There is a subset that are approved by the agency. They're just not physically submitted to the agency for approval. They're generally more basic in nature and have the required features. A sketch approval, whether it's a sketch label, which is really the concept of a label, and we do require certain sketch labels to be submitted to the agency for evaluation and approval, and we'll ultimately give those sketch approval or sketch modified, which we'll discuss more in a moment. We also have final labels. Those are the labels that are actually applied to the finished product as they go out into commerce, and we also have labels that are considered temporary, which are used in certain situations. So for the labels that need to be submitted to FSIS for evaluation under this prior label approval program, we amended our regulations in 2013, effective 2014, to require 4 categories. These include labels for temporary approval. And if you're not familiar with temporary approval, if a label is deficient in some particular, maybe an ingredient is listed out of order, but it doesn't create a health or safety situation and does not provide the company an economic advantage, we can grant temporary approval to use that label while changes are made. So just a couple examples. If a company was making a claim such as meatball made with grass-fed beef, and they had some issues with their supplier and they wanted to use beef that was not grass-raised, we would not grant that temporary approval. Clearly, granting that temporary would provide that company an economic advantage, so we would not do that. Relating to ingredients, I mentioned minor changes, but for example, if salt was 10th in the order of predominance, and now they wanted to adjust it to be second, and it significantly changed the nutritional profile of that product, so the amount of sodium was greater than 20% of the declared value on the label, that's another situation where we would not grant temporary approval because it would be of concern to some individuals, particularly a low sodium diet, for example. So we evaluate those on a case-by-case basis. Labels for products produced under religious exemptions is a very small category. Essentially, they may deviate from some part of a regulation, such as head-on, feed-on, poultry. Labels for products with export or labeling deviations, and this is, we've been talking today, and we'll talk later today about domestic labeling requirements. We do allow deviations from those domestic labeling requirements if they're for export only, and if they're in compliance with the importing country's labeling requirements. And so when we conduct our label approval, we're looking for information to support that the label is in compliance with the importing country's labeling requirements. And finally, the largest category of labels that we see fall into this special statements and claims, and we've published guidance that identifies not only the examples of label claims that are commonly used on meat and poultry products, but also in some cases the documentation that needs to be submitted to support the label claim for label approval. And the reason why FSIS requires these 4 categories is because it felt that these 4 categories were more likely to present significant policy issues relating to health or economic factors. So we're going to transition into a little bit here about the labeling records. We do have requirements. We actually updated them in the 2013 rulemaking as well. The final label, again, that's the label that's applied to the product, needs to be included in the labeling record. Product formulation, processing procedures, and anything to support other claims that may be made on the label to support that they are truthful and not misleading. And so these labeling records are important because our inspection program personnel that are in the plants are conducting label verification activities, which we'll discuss in a little bit greater detail in just a moment. And so they need to have that information available to not only verify label approval in some cases, but also to conduct that verification activity. And one such activity falls under directive. Directives provide permanent instructions to our inspection program personnel unless they're deleted, modified, or amended. So we have permanent instructions in place for the ongoing formulation verification task. As mentioned yesterday in a presentation, there's been a sustained number of recalls for undeclared allergens, many of which were the result of in-plant inspection activities. And so this directive is targeting particularly products that are multi-ingredient products that contain other ingredients such as purchased seasoning mixes or other purchased foods. If you're making a meatball and it's formulated with bread, that's going to be a purchased component. And so the inspectors are looking at what's actually going into the formulation, comparing it to the product formula in the labeling record, also comparing it to what's declared on the label, and there's specific instructions on how to document a non-compliance and also to prioritize the highest risk products essentially when conducting that label verification activity. Again, we're targeting these multi-ingredient products that may contain one of the big 8 allergens. Okay. And then there's jumped one ahead. There's a general label verification activity, and this is republished in 2014 when we updated our prior label approval. And so it provides instructions to inspection program personnel on how to conduct a label verification activity. Essentially, what features should they be looking for, the mark of inspection, the handling statement, are they in compliance with the regulations? And it's focused again on the final label. A sketch is an important part if you need to get your label approved by the staff, but really what we're verifying is that the label on the product, is it consistent with the product formula and what's in the record to protect public health. And so when labeling is not compliant, there are some corrective actions that an establishment can take. They could submit for temporary label approval, and we would evaluate on a case-by-case basis whether temporary approval is appropriate, again, ensuring that there's no public health or safety issues or providing the company economic advantage. In other cases, a label could be brought into compliance with pressure-sensitive stickers, essentially to cover a feature that may not be compliant, to bring it into compliance. And finally, I wanted to talk today about procedures for rescinding or refusing approval and our regulations for the rules of practice. We do have the authority, if a label is found, the agency might find a label on a product in commerce that's not in compliance. They would bring that to the attention of the labeling staff, or maybe from a competitor that might find a product in commerce that they don't think is in compliance. So we'll evaluate those on a case-by-case basis and determine whether they're in compliance with FSIS regulations. In the case they're not, we can reduce a label to temporary approval if there's no health or safety issue, or we could rescind the label to prevent its future use. And so there's a lot of ongoing working with our inspection program personnel, as you can see, with the verification activities, and also in some cases rescinding or refusing approval. We're working closely to get more information about the products, and then and then what actions may be taken if they're found to be not in compliance. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Geoff, and thank you, Doug. I think that was a lot of really helpful information, and you can certainly tell they're both experts in their field. Next, we want to talk about the current landscape for food labeling. We're going to start off with Matthew Michael. He is the Director of the Issuances Staff in the Office of Policy and Program Development at FSIS, followed by Dr. Douglas Valentine, the Director of the Office of Nutrition and Food Labeling at CFSAN. Matthew?
Good morning. As Selena said, the topic of this session is the current landscape for food labeling. And I'm going to get there by telling you about a petition that USDA received back in February. This petition is one of several catalysts behind not only the current ongoing examination of animal cell culture technology by USDA and FDA, but also a catalyst for this meeting. So as Selena said, I am the Director of the Issuances Staff in the Office of Policy and Program Development at FSIS. Not surprisingly, the issuance staff in the Office of Policy manages the development of policy issuances. These would include Federal Register publications, such as notices, proposed rules, and final rules, which could pertain to labeling, guidance to industry, which also could pertain to labeling, instructions to our inspectors, which many of you will know as FSIS directives and notices, which could pertain to the verification of the truthfulness of labeling, and FSIS responses to petitions. So let's talk about petitions. A petition for rulemaking, which is what we typically call it, is a written request to FSIS to issue, amend, or repeal a regulation or policy. Anyone can file a petition with FSIS. We have regulations governing the petition process in Volume 9 of the Code of Federal Regulations in Part 392. The regulations contain instructions on how to submit a petition, describe the type of information that may help FSIS to review a petition in a more efficient manner, and they also permit interested parties to comment on the petition while we're reviewing it. After a petition has been filed, FSIS evaluates the requested action to determine whether we should grant or deny the petition. We consider the supporting information included with the petition, as well as any comments we receive. After we complete our review, we inform the petitioner in writing of whether or not we will grant or deny the petition, what action we'll take, and we post our response on our webpage as well. All our petitions, comments, and responses to comments are available to the public both in our docket room here in the South Building and also online. In the event where we have a petition that generates a lot of public interest and a lot of public comment, we often also put it on regulations.gov. And that's the case in the petition in question I'll be talking about today. And this is a screenshot of regulations.gov if you've never seen it. You can get there for our petitions often by a link on the FSIS website petition page, but you could also go directly here, and they have a number of ways you can search for our regulations, our petitions, comments, and those of other federal agencies. So the petition in question, this is a petition was filed by the U.S. Cattlemen's Association, or USCA, as I'll call them. It concerns the labeling of cell-cultured meat products and other products that may be marketed like meat but are not meat necessarily. It was submitted to USDA on February 9th. We've received over 6,000 public comments, all of which are on regulations.gov. I looked yesterday, there's 6,159 right now. It's still under consideration. We continue to examine the petition and the supplementary material that was provided with it. It was a lengthy petition with a lot of attachments. We're looking at all the comments on the petition, and we'll be considering the comments made at this meeting and submitted in writing in response to this meeting. So what did USDA request? First, they asked us to limit the definition of beef to products from cattle born, raised, and harvested in a traditional manner. Second, they ask us to limit the definition of meat to the tissue or flesh of animals that have been harvested in the traditional manner. And notably, they made a point in their petition that they wanted these definitions to distinguish traditionally produced meat not only from products cultured from animal cells, but also from products made from plants or insects that are labeled or marketed like meat. Also, interestingly, the petition does not request that we change our regulations. They don't request that we go through rulemaking to affect these definitions. Instead, they ask that we amend what's known as the FSIS Standards and Labeling Policy Book. The policy book is guidance. It's intended to help industry produce labels that are neither false or misleading. But also you can use the guidance to create what are called generically approved labels, labels that would not have to go through prior approval. So the policy book is incorporated by reference into our regulations, but it's not a regulation in itself. It's guidance you can use. And that's an interesting facet of this petition. So our response to this petition, in light of the development of cultured cell products, will obviously be an example of how we respond to the labeling of new meat and poultry products. And again, we'll be considering all the comments we've received, the supplementary information before we respond. FSIS has a lot of experience in regard to the labeling of new meat and poultry products because they're being developed all the time, as well as novel processes to treat those products. And I'll give you a few examples. So we have irradiated products. We published regulations in 1999, so we actually have regulatory requirements for their labeling, which include the inclusion of the radura, it's the radiation symbol on the label, as well as a statement that the product was irradiated, or the use of the word irradiated as part of the product name. We also have advanced meat recovery products. We have labeling requirements that are determined by the constituents of the final product of advanced meat recovery. It determines whether it can be called pork, for example, or mechanically separated pork instead. We also have, it's not totally new, it's developing high pressure processing. We don't have positive labeling requirements for this. You don't have to state that on the label, but we have reviewed a number of claims regarding high pressure products, high pressure treated products on the labels of those products. And then a final example is products with modified atmosphere packaging. And we have labeling requirements for those products depending on the gas that is used for the modified atmosphere in the package. So for all of these products and for future products, such as cell culture products, we would apply the same statutory and regulatory standards, ensuring that the labeling is neither false nor misleading, and to make sure that consumers are given enough information to make an informed purchase. So I hope this discussion by getting there by way of talking about the petition was helpful in showing how FSIS reviews the labeling of new and novel products. Thank you.
So this time I wasn't planning to have slides, so we're in a little better shape. I'm just going to make some brief comments about the current landscape. I think, as you're all aware, the food marketplace is rapidly changing and innovating as new technologies are being matured and become economically viable to use to produce new products in novel ways. I mean, for example, the topic of this particular public meeting is looking at how cell culture technology is being developed for the applications of producing new food products, bringing unique products into the marketplace. We've seen rapid advances in agricultural changes. For example, we've gone to greenhouses to now we are entering the age of vertical farming, where we have large warehouses growing fresh produce that are across from large distribution centers that are rapidly allowing fresh products into the marketplace. That's changing the dynamics of how we get agricultural products. We see the emergence of insect proteins being explored as a way of cheap, inexpensive, high-quality proteins to assure that there's sufficient protein available for meeting the needs of the growing population. And through biotechnology and bioengineering, we're seeing the evolution of typically food ingredients that would only appear from animal sources are now being produced from plant-based sources. So we have hemoglobins being produced in plants that can be used in production of plant-based patties. We're seeing dairy proteins being put into a variety of plant sources that will allow those proteins to be produced from yeasts and other plant sources. So the landscape is rapidly changing. So we're looking at that landscape and looking at how we need to adapt our view of our regulations to take into account the rapidly changing landscape. Clearly, we'll continue to always focus on the principles that clear, truthful, and not misleading labeling will be critical foundations to making sure that consumers are understanding the products that are coming into the marketplace and can understand how they are either similar or different from more traditional products in the marketplace, with a focus on making sure that these products are both safe and keeping track of whether or not these new products are nutritionally adequate or how they're nutritionally different from more traditional products. Because we do believe that truthful and not transparent labeling is really critical so that consumers can build diet patterns that are consistent with our national guidelines, because those diet patterns are essential to public health. In doing this, we do maintain very strong partnerships. We work closely with USDA, and this meeting is an example of one of those partnerships. We also work closely with CDC and NIH in order to make sure that all of our work is based on sound science. So we really do view that this is a critical time for us to be looking at the emerging landscape of how the food landscape is changing, and that we think we can really make sure that we can advance public health as a public health agency by empowering consumers with the right information to facilitate building healthy diet patterns, and at the same time enabling industry to innovate into the changing landscape and marketplace. As you might all be aware of, Commissioner Gottlieb, who spoke yesterday, announced earlier this year our nutrition innovation strategy, which is looking ahead at how FDA can begin to take a fresh look at how its regulations can be applied in part to this changing food landscape in order to help build healthier diet patterns. So while the strategy is still in its early stages of development, we are looking at how we might amend our food standards principles to take into account the rapidly changing food landscape, to make sure that it has the flexibility to do what it needs to do, but also allow product innovation. We've signaled that we're going to update the regulatory definition of healthy, and we hope to be coming forward with a proposed rule on what that new definition might look for. And we're looking at how we approach our health claims, which I'll talk about this afternoon. We did have a public meeting earlier this year on July 26th to begin the public dialogue similar to this meeting around how the nutrition innovation strategy might be developed and evolved, and we had an open docket that closed on October the 11th, just a couple weeks ago. We received over 5,000 comments from the public into that docket, and are currently looking at reviewing those dockets, as that public comment period is really critical to inform us in part on the way forward. And I would encourage you all to also take advantage of the opportunity to provide comments into the docket that will be open for this particular meeting, because public comments are critical. The petition process that you heard from USDA-FDA has a similar petition process where citizens or groups can petition the FDA asking us to consider changes in our policies or regulatory actions. And as USDA had received a petition around labeling of these cell-based products, we've received a citizen's petition from the Good Foods Institute, who you heard speak yesterday, asking us to consider a naming framework on how standardized terms such as milk or meat might be used in the naming of plant-based alternative foods. So we've received that petition. It's up in the docket, so people can also look at it and comment to that docket. And similar to USDA, we are currently looking at that petition and considering how we might respond to that petition. But public comment, again, is critical to helping us make sure that all can have an informed and voice in how we might move forward in reviewing that petition that would set the basis for how we might name a variety of plant-based alternative or alternative food products that will be emerging in the marketplace in the future. So in closing, I'd really like to say that this morning we did share with you some thoughts on food labeling, and you can see that there is a lot of consistency between the labeling approaches of both USDA and FDA. We really look forward to continuing the dialogue today and hearing your views and your input on food labeling, because your input is critical. So thank you.
Okay, well, we're running a little early this morning. We're running ahead of schedule, so we're going to take a break a little bit early. Let's reconvene back here in 15 minutes, so that'll be 5 minutes to the hour. We'll see you then. The slides will be posted? Absolutely, you're welcome. You're welcome. If you want to go ahead and take your seats, we'll get started in 1 minute. Okay, welcome back. I hope everyone got a chance to stretch your legs. We're going to go ahead and move on to our next session, which is open public comments, and I want to introduce Malcolm Bertoni. He's the Associate Commissioner for Planning at FDA.
Welcome back, everyone, and good morning. My name is Malcolm Bertoni. I'm the Associate Commissioner for Planning at FDA, and I'll be your moderator for this next session. As you know from yesterday, if you were here, or if you haven't, I'll just explain that one of the important purposes of today's meeting is to gather input and commentary from the public. And this session here is an open comment period, so you do not have to have signed up. If you have some particular thoughts that you would like to share, we very much want to hear them. We're soliciting comments on the labeling aspects of the discussion that we've had, so we would appreciate it if you have comments that you do share them on the labeling. And if we have time, we can perhaps entertain some other comments as well. But we have two microphones down here near the front of the stage here. And we have some ushers who can help maintain orderly lines. And we ask that you just come down and the ushers will direct you to one of the two microphones. Now, in order to make sure that we allow everyone to have an opportunity to speak today, we do have a 3-minute time limit for each comment. So there's a screen where you can monitor your time available. Also, we very much would like for you to state your name and your affiliation. So, without any further ado, let's start the session and begin with our first speaker.
Hello, my name is Liz Holtz, and I'm speaking today on behalf of the Animal Legal Defense Fund. I'm set to give formal comments later this afternoon, but I'd like to offer the following comments about the issue of safety addressed yesterday. I want to first thank the USDA and FDA for the opportunity to participate in this public meeting. The Animal Legal Defense Fund commends the agencies for giving this critical issue of animal cell culture technology such careful consideration. The potential for animal cell culture technology to transform how we produce meat and other animal products cannot be overstated. Conventional production and slaughter practices are inhumane, unsafe, and environmentally destructive, and more consumers want alternatives. In light of the enormous benefits this technology offers, we urge USDA and FDA to employ an efficient and transparent regulatory pathway that spurs innovation while ensuring product safety, instilling consumer confidence, and preventing deceptive labeling for all animal products, whether made from slaughtering animals or culturing cells. On the question of safety, innovation in the meat industry is urgently needed. Conventional methods rely on the intensive confinement of animals in unsanitary and inhumane facilities. These unnatural conditions require extensive use of antibiotics to address diseases that proliferate among the crowded, stressed animals, contributing to the spread of drug-resistant superbugs. Animal slaughter further involves broad potential for adulteration as meat comes into contact with fecal matter and other contaminants. These adulteration risks are compounded by overly fast slaughtering speeds that make detection of contaminants and disease more difficult, and the turning over to ill-trained slaughterhouse workers of critical food safety inspection tasks, a program USDA is, at this moment, poised to expand to pig slaughterhouses nationwide. In contrast to slaughtering live animals, meat produced using animal cell culturing can be produced in aseptic, controlled environments that present significantly fewer and different food safety threats. The vast differences between these production methods show that USDA would not be the appropriate agency to regulate their safety, even if it had jurisdiction over their production. Instead, FDA should build on its significant experience regulating other cell culture technology applications to develop a process that ensures food safety for these new animal products. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. And I know we have some technology to help us with the timeline, but it does require a manual step. So we need someone to help man the clock. Great, thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity to submit these comments. I'm Jessica Elmy. I'm the Policy Director from the Good Food Institute. We appreciate the agencies thinking through these issues to ensure that adequate information is provided to consumers and bright lines are created for producers thinking about labeling cell-based products. Consumers are enthusiastic about these products. We did a poll with the firm Faunalytics, and we found that 2/3 of Americans are willing to try meat grown from cells without slaughtering animals, and 40% said they would pay a premium for these products. The expectations are that these products are healthy, safe, and environmentally sustainable while looking and tasting the same as conventional meat. As to the FDA's specific questions, yes, the source of the cells, the species from which the cells come, should be required information on the label. This is important to protect consumers from potential allergens, as Dr. Valentine pointed out earlier. We also think that there needs to be flexibility for labeling requirements. Standards of identity have shown that they have limited utility in light of other disclosures on labels, and it's difficult, if not impossible, for federal agencies to keep up with the growing choices in the marketplace. Fundamentally, standards of identity, or statements of identity, must follow the two principles that Dr. Maine enumerated in her remarks this morning for all aspects of the label, that they be truthful and not misleading. Plant-based products regularly reference meat counterparts to convey information on their flavor profiles and how they're used. They also use modifiers like plant-based or vegan on their labels. So long as consumers are not misled, these products are not mislabeled. We, of course, urge FDA to grant GFI's petition, which was mentioned before the break. We have every expectation that cultured meat companies will have incentives to set their products apart when they're first introduced into the marketplace. Initially, the products will be clearly communicated the way that their products have been produced because it's important to consumers and they will command a price premium. Over time, we think it's important to see whether the production process is material to consumers. As Mr. Canavan said, labels should provide consumers the information they need to make purchase decisions in the supermarket. Moreover, they should not advantage some producers over others. We look forward to providing formal written comments on this topic and thank the FDA and USDA for this opportunity.
Thank you for your comments.
Good morning. My name is Barbara Kowalczyk. I'm from The Ohio State University, and please forgive me, I have a bad cold. But I'd like to make a couple of comments on labeling and risk communication, which has been basically talked about this morning. I would like to preface this by saying I'm an epidemiologist and statistician by training. My PhD is in environmental health, and I would love to see food products that can be developed, that can be produced in environmentally and friendly and sustainable ways. That said, I have some significant concerns about some of the claims that are being made about these products. These products have been put out in the public purview as being clean meat, which may give consumers the misrepresentation that these products are sterile. They will not be sterile. As I'm a member of the FDA Science Board, although I do not speak on behalf of the FDA Science Board, and I encourage everyone to read the transcripts from Monday's discussion, which we had in depth. The environment in which cell-based products are grown in cell culture medium is very conducive to the growth of all pathogens. And so if that becomes contaminated, there will be contamination in the ultimate product. In addition, the scaffolding elements, the elements used in scaffolding these new products may have hazardous effects on the public. And that needs to be clearly labeled considered during the labeling process. How do we label what has gone into growing this product and then in the cell culture medium? So for example, in some cases, based on the research that I read, human growth hormones are being used to produce in the culture medium. And how is that going to go into the labeling process? The other thing that I think, and I see my time's running out, the other thing that I think that is important for the agencies to consider is these products are being touted as being more environmentally friendly and sustainable than traditional meat and poultry products. I have no idea. I do understand that there are significant environmental impacts through traditional production, but I want to understand how is this going to differ. I think the impacts will be different, but I still think there will be impacts. At the FDA Science Board meeting on Monday, it was stated that it will take 5,000 liters of fluid to produce 1 to 2 kilograms of product. That's half of a milk tanker. What happens when we have contaminated product that cannot be put out onto the marketplace? Where is that recalled product going to go? Where are the byproducts of this process going to go? If companies start marketing this as being environmentally sustainable, do we have a definition of that for the labeling process? And that's something that I think my time's up, so I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Please state your name and affiliation.
Hi, my name is Michael Hansen. I'm a senior scientist at Consumers Union, the Advocacy Division of Consumer Reports, an independent nonprofit organization with 7 million members worldwide, nationwide, that work side by side with consumers for truth, transparency, and fairness in the marketplace. And what I'd like to talk about is we did a survey of a nationally representative phone survey using random digit dialing of 1,018 U.S. Adults this June, and the data were statistically weighted so that respondents in the survey are demographically and geographically representative of the U.S. population. The first question we basically asked is how Americans think the packages should be labeled. And the first question we ask is if you were to see a package for purchase at a grocery store or other location containing food that is produced in a laboratory from animal cells to look and taste like meat, how do you think the package should be labeled? Only 5% said it should be called meat without any further explanation. A little over half, 52%, said it should be meat, but accompanied with an explanation as to how it was produced. 43% said it should be labeled something other than meat. We then asked people for what should it say on the label. We gave them 7 choices, and we actually randomized those choices in terms of how we ordered them. Those 7 were lab-grown meat, artificial or synthetic meat, something without the words meat, beef, pork. Third was animal-free meat, such as no pig, pork, cowless beef, cultured meat, clean meat, and in vitro meat. The 2 that were at the top, lab-grown meat, 35% said that it should be labeled that. 34% said it should be labeled artificial or synthetic meat, and at the bottom were clean meat at 9%, in vitro meat at 8%, and then a little above that at 11% was cultured meat. So we think consumers have made it clear that how they would like to see this product labeled is, number 1, it should make very clear how it was produced. And number 2, they should use terms that consumers understand. And from our sampling, that clearly shows it's either lab-grown meat or artificial meat, because those collectively got almost 70% of the samples. And again, at the bottom were in vitro meat, clean meat, and cultured meat. So we think this should be labeled as either lab-grown meat or artificial or synthetic meat, because that's what consumers have said. And one potential problem with cultured meat or even cell-cultured is some consumers might not realize what culture means. They could think that, oh, is a cultured meat product one that for example, likes opera and all these other things, which is a different form of culture. So I think we have to use terms that consumers understand. And we'll submit this. We'll also make detailed comments and submit this survey to the docket.
Thank you very much.
My name is Ames Perry. I'm the director of Food Resource, which is a regulatory consulting group to the food industry. And I just wanted to note, yesterday during session 2, which was the potential hazards for cell culture technology, products derived from livestock and poultry, Dr. Fasano of FDA mentioned the nutritional manipulation of cultured meat and poultry products, the possibility to do that, which of course will impact nutrition claims, but I think there are a lot of other claims that could be made about the altered nutrition that need to be considered when we're looking at who needs to regulate this. And I think because FDA does not do prior label approval, I would also make the case that those considerations would make it more natural fit for FSIS. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Hello, Mike Selden, co-founder and CEO of Finless Foods. In terms of labeling, I just want to make one quick point. Lab-grown meat, as a name, is not just wrong, it's just incredibly inaccurate. We are not going to be producing anything at scale in a lab. A lab is, by its nature, single like small experiments. It's the same way that beer is prototyped. Like in any brewery that you go to, you will find like a white room, lab coats, science-type benches with black tabletops, and that's where they'll be prototyping and designing new types of beer, which is then produced in a brewery. And so to use the word lab-grown meat and to even suggest that that is an option in this case is intensely misleading and also not setting up a fair playing field. If we are lab-grown meat, then beer is lab-grown beer. So if you're going to change our label, change that one too. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yet again. Okay. Good morning. My name is Eric Schulze. I'm the Vice President of Product and Regulation at Memphis Meats. As Secretary Perdue noted yesterday, in the next 50 years, the world will demand as much protein as has been produced in all of human history to this point. To feed the growing planet, protein production must increase and become more efficient. This will require many innovative partners, including traditional food producers, large and small, as well as cell-based meat, poultry, and seafood companies. To meet this challenge, this pursuit of innovation must occur not only in industry, but also within government. Appropriate existing regulation allows for such innovation while ensuring safety through sound, risk-based policies. And no one company, industry, or government agency can address this alone. Memphis Meats strongly believes and has stated previously that cell-based products and technology are an and not an or solution. Recognizing our shared desire to support innovation and feed the growing world, Memphis Meats uses the term cell-based meat and poultry to describe the products that are a result of animal cell culture. We know that a wide array of terms have been used to describe our products and technology in this room, in the media, by stakeholders, and even within our nascent industry. And I'd like to take a moment to explain why we believe that cell-based meat, poultry, and seafood is the right term to describe our products and technology. Some terms, like fake, synthetic, or artificial meat, are intended to not only cast our products in a negative light, but are also simply false and misleading. We're making real meat and seafood, and that's the whole point. The term lab-grown has an accuracy problem as well. As with many familiar and currently marketed food products, the early development of our products happens in food labs, but the products that we bring to consumers will be produced in food production facilities, not labs. We also no longer believe the term clean is the right term. While we've used it in the past, our primary intent was to highlight the sustainability aspect and controlled production environment we are developing. Since then, we've heard feedback from many stakeholders, and we've learned that the term clean can be confusing, is perceived as disparaging, and does not fully convey our process and product to consumers. Now, we value that feedback. That's why Memphis Meats has begun using the term cell-based meat, poultry, and seafood. This term is clear, factual, and inclusive. It organizes products into categories that will help consumers. It is distinct from plant-based proteins and animal-based meats. It differentiates our products while also clearly conveying that that cell-based meat is in fact real meat. We are encouraged by the fact that others are beginning to use this term cell-based as well. Now, we know that determining the appropriate terminology for food labeling depends on certain factors, including the characteristics of the finished product and applicable standards of identity or other regulations. As we continue to answer these regulatory questions, we hope that using the term cell-based has opened the door for a broader conversation and commitment from all stakeholders to describe the products of animal cell culture in a clear, accurate, and transparent way moving forward. We look forward to working with stakeholders as well as USDA and FDA to clarify the appropriate labeling terminology and regulatory framework for cell-based meat, poultry, and seafood ingredients. We thank the agencies for convening this important meeting and for the opportunity to comment. Thank you.
Thank you. It looks like the line has died down, so I'd encourage people who are thinking to come on up and offer your comments.
I'll go to the shorter microphone. Hi, everybody. I have a question for you a little bit later on, so pay attention. Still too tall. Hi, everybody. My name is Alain Rostin. I'm the CEO of Simple Foods Collaborative, or just Simple, a new research and development company intending to one day commercialize blended cell-based lean fish products. Along with Memphis Meats, we've been calling the products we hope to commercialize one day as cell-based since July for all those reasons. I am very lucky. My mother passed away
2 years ago at 90, in love and in peace, completely healthy. Mom used to say there were two kinds of people in the world, those who ate to live and those who lived to eat. She was one who lived to eat. And Cornish hens, lamb chops, and ground beef were her protein staples. Therefore, I'd like to start by thanking the USDA and FDA for your organization's important work in keeping us all safe, fed, and healthy, past, present, and future. I'd like to then extend my thanks to all of meat and poultry and seafood if you're here. I will never forget my gratitude for helping to give my mother such a long, healthy life. We have an extraordinarily safe food system in the USA, so I'd like to circle back to the conversation about allergens and build on what Mike Selden brought up yesterday around allergies to fish, and also build on what Susan May raised here earlier today around how improper listing of allergens is the leading cause of recalls. Quick poll, how many of you know what yellow perch is? Or Wahoo? They're species of commercial fish. So, it is estimated that 0.4% of the US population is allergic to fish. That's 1.3 million Americans who are allergic to fish. That's not shellfish, which is another 2% of the population that overlaps. I believe the right thing to do for cell-based fish for maximum consumer safety is that the ingredients label and allergy contains labels must not only make it clear that the food product in question contains a specific species, but also make it clear that it's fish. Fish is one of 8 allergens with specific labeling requirements under the Food Allergen Labeling and Consumer Protection Act of 2004. Under that law, manufacturers of packaged food products sold in the US and containing fish or a fish product as an ingredient must identify on the ingredient label in clear language the specific type of fish used. So as I understand it, it must list the species. But because we don't know what these things are, Wahoo, people who are allergic to one fish are generally advised to avoid all species of fish, unless they specifically know they are not allergic to that fish. So, unless we learn otherwise, it's safe to assume that the proteins responsible for fish allergies will be present in the cell-based fish protein we intend to one day grow and harvest. That's why it's not enough to list the species name. To minimize serious allergy reactions for 1.3 million Americans, the ingredients label and contains label need to make it perfectly clear without ambiguity that by consuming this product, the consumer is consuming fish and is consuming Wahoo. It's also why we can't call it artificial, because then people will wonder if they're going to be allergic to it or not. In conclusion, to avoid serious dangers to those with fish allergies, all cell-based seafood will need to include labeling that says both fish and Wahoo, both the word fish and the name of the species. In closing, I'd like to remind us that everyone here wants to feed people safe, healthy, and clean food. We share the same interest. Thank you again to the USDA, FDA, and everyone here for embracing a rational, thoughtful, collaborative, and empathetic science-based approach to regulating cell-based meat, poultry, and seafood. Thank you.
Thank you. And let us know if those are going to be your formal comments or... Okay, great, thank you. So the line has died down again. I'm going to display, if I can, the second set of slides, second set of questions on the other slide, just in case that inspires some additional thoughts that folks may want to share. So, would anyone, there we go. Thank you for sharing your name and affiliation.
Danny Beer, the U.S. Cattlemen's Association. I just want to start by thanking all of USDA and FDA for having this. I know it was kind of the answer to our petition that brought this up, and certainly appreciate your collaboration on this. So the questions that you guys have asked, I would say yes to all these questions. We should have standards of identity to identify these products as different than beef and meat. We feel that beef and meat have already been defined. Consumers, when I travel, tell me all the time that when they purchase product at the grocery store, they think of what we're doing as families on the land, taking care of the land, taking care of those cattle every day. They don't think about somebody putting a group of cells together and growing a new product. That's not beef. Should the methods by which animal cell cultured proteins are produced be communicated as well? Yes, it should be. I truly think people know how beef is produced historically. This is a new method. It needs to be explained explicitly. Should the sources of the animal cells be put on the label? Yes. How should products containing both animal cells and cultured products or traditional meat be labeled? I really think they shouldn't be combined. That's my opinion. If they do, I think you need to label that as such, and probably they need their own identification and inspection system altogether. I don't think it should be the same beef inspection system at all. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello. That'll work. I'm Brian Spears, co-founder and CEO of New Age Meats. We make pork, so pork from animal cells instead of animal slaughter. And I'd like to, I have the distinct and rare privilege of being able to taste our cell-based meat. So I remember the first time I did taste it, which was about a month and a half ago. We were making it for the first time, and we had several containers of meat, some of which we had bought at the store, pork, we bought at the store. We ground it up because it was similar to what we were producing. And then we also had the stuff that we made. We had them in different concentrations, and we had a chef there that was cooking up our meat. And first we tried one sample, and I ate it and said, okay, that's bacon, recognized bacon. So what's next? And our chef said, no, that's your meat. And so I said, wait, it's not like, when I ate it, it's not like it was or was like meat. It was meat. It was perfectly mistakable for meat because it is meat. In fact, we then fed it to 40 people who came and had our cell-based pork sausage, and including a reporter from Business Insider. And to quote her, "It tasted like meat. Then again, it is meat." I wasn't sure I would have been able to tell the difference between this pork sausage and any other. When we go to market and label this, it would be simply dishonest to label it as anything other than meat. Thank you.
Thank you. So if there are any other folks who are planning to give their formal public comments, or anyone who would like to provide some additional comments, you may come forward.
Barbara Kowalczyk, The Ohio State University. I don't have any formal comments. This is just an additional comment. I think it's very clear from the good discussion this morning that there's a lot of debate about how to label these. And I think that this is something that the agencies are going to have to look at very carefully, involve social and behavioral scientists in determining how to label this. One thing that always strikes me when I come to these meetings and other scientific meetings is we get into these discussions as should it be cell-based or cultured. Every person in this room is not normal. Okay, we know things that most of the American public does not understand. And so what we think it should be labeled in some ways is irrelevant. We need to engage normal, average consumers in in-depth studies, and that's going to require a lot of engagement of social and behavioral scientists in figuring out how to label this appropriately so that the average American consumer, who may not know what a culture is and may not remember what a cell is, as sad as that may sound, to adequately describe this risk to them. Okay? There are going to be risks with this product. It's not going to be risk-free, and we have a hard time explaining the risks with traditional food products to the American public. And For those of you that don't know me, and I want to also comment, and I have my grandstand here. You know, I've heard a lot of people talk about how safe our food supply is, and it is one of the safest in the world, and I do want to commend the agencies for the work that they do. But there have been a large number of recalls from both agencies just in the last week. And someone made the comment earlier that most people understand how our food is produced. No, they do not. Most Americans are out of touch with how products are produced in this country. And so I want to caution us in making a lot of assumptions about what people do and do not understand about these risks, and that's going to require the agencies to do a lot of work, which is actually pretty difficult for them to do given some of the Data Reduction Act and things like that. Doing the kind of social and behavioral research that we need to do around these products is difficult, so it's going to require partnerships from academia and from industry to get that done before we can have a full vetted conversation about how these products should be labeled. And I'm going to make a stab, I'm going to also request again that we think about how these are going to be labeled in terms of environmentally sustainable and clean. I know I'm at my limit, but one of the things that I've heard is repeatedly on Monday, yesterday, and today is the fact that antibiotics are not going to be used in these products. That is not true. Antimicrobials will be used in these products. If they're produced in an aseptic environment, they have to use antimicrobials to get there. And so these are things that consumers are aware of. They're concerned about the environment. They're concerned about antibiotic stewardship. And if these products are not labeled properly so that consumers have the information they need to make informed decisions, it's going to be misleading. I'm not saying I have the solution. I'm just saying that there's a lot of work that needs to be done to figure this out. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker.
Hello, I'm Sharon Nadenblut. For many years, I worked at FDA doing communications and stakeholder engagement. I'm now a private consultant, and I monitor a number of these issues. And I'd like to make a comment, one about communications and two about stakeholder engagement. The one about communications builds on what Barbara just said. I am aware of the consumer research that both sides have done, and I don't think anyone's surprised by the findings that both sides have come out with based on who they are. And I would urge that for anyone truly interested in this issue, now's the time to get it right. Spend the money, take the time to do real consumer research, not just surveying simply what, oh, here's 5 names, what do you think of them? What does this mean to you? That's an important step. It's not the first step, it's not the key step. This is a new technology. It has to do with food. You have to put your communications and thinking of the naming in the context of how people eat, what they think about their food, why they want to consider a different type of meat, why they love the meat that they eat, whether they'll consider, how does this fit all together? Really listen to them. It's not a quick survey of here are the 5 names or here are the more names and what do you think. They don't know enough about it. So rather than just asking them for the names, probe deeply to understand how they think about it and how it will fit, what the context is. And I think from that, everyone will be able to come out with something that will be far superior. I also think that it's wonderful. I heard Memphis Meats and some others talking about the stakeholder engagement and that it actually moved them away from the term clean. I think that's remarkable and wonderful. I think it's completely understandable that the industry hated the term clean for obvious reasons, and that was very good that they spoke up about that. And it's very good that there are those who are considering what other alternatives are. if there's that kind of reasonableness, if there's a true willingness to have USDA involved and FDA involved in their respective complementary manners, I think that we can do a lot better than what happened with GMOs. And so I would hope that maybe some of the lessons of what FDA did on FSMA, collaborative forums that were hosted by, in that case it was Pew, look for some groups who have not staked out such a strong position but can be true mediators and bring together. I think there's much that everyone in this room can come out with something. It's ultimately all about consumer confidence. And the more that they're seen as being two sides who are battling each other, the more that raises concerns among consumers about eating meat and eating this cell-based meat, or whatever the term is that ultimately is decided. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Next speaker.
Hello, I'm Brett Kinsey. I'm a cattle rancher from South Dakota. I'm here as an individual, and this is not my official statement. I do have a couple impromptu statements that I've come up with as I listen to this, and I've gained a tremendous appreciation for what USDA and FDA do. I appreciate what they do, and I appreciate the task that they have ahead of them. Statement 2, again unofficial. In the last 2 years, the live cattle supply chain, ranchers, have dramatically changed their use of antibiotics. People made the call and we answered. Now, a vet prescription is required for all antibiotic use. Label directions have been changed for antibiotic use. We've always had withdrawal times for antibiotic use. And one more thing I thought of while I came up here is antibiotics are expensive, people. We only use them when we need them. I'd like to finish with a question. How will antibiotic use be regulated in cell culture technology? Will they have prescriptions to get? Will they have withdrawal times to respect? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Do we have another commenter?
See, I don't know if I'm tall enough, Eric. My name is Jack Bobo. I'm with Intrexon, and just a couple of comments. The first is that I think a lot of the challenges with labeling that have been raised this morning apply to our entire food system. I think that consumers really don't understand, many consumers, I think it's about a quarter, don't understand whether or not a cow was involved in producing low-fat milk. So I think we need to recognize the starting point that we have for the entire food system. And so there are definitely challenges. I think people have never cared more nor known less how their food is produced. And that's a challenge for all of us. People care passionately and they're asking for things and changes to our policies, and yet they have very little understanding what our food system is all about today. So there are broader goals that we need to achieve in terms of educating the public about what our food system is. I guess I don't really see a huge amount of difference in this room on the labeling question. I think that on one hand we have the companies that are producing cell-based products that passionately want to convey to the consumer that their product is different. So if they want to convey that information, then the question is how to convey that information. And so I think we need to go through the process of making sure that we convey it in the best way possible. So I think that on both sides of this conversation, everybody wants that to be the case. So hopefully we'll focus on the things that we have in common. I think it's also worth pointing out that people love innovation almost as much as they despise change, and there's no place they despise change more than in the food they eat. Food is what brings us together as family, as friends, and if you mess with my food, you're messing with my family. But if we don't change how we produce food, everything will change. And so I think that we need to recognize that the agriculture industry has changed dramatically over the last 30 years. It uses 50% less water to produce a kilogram of beef from the livestock industry. They've done amazing things. And this is just one more change. we need to produce 50% more protein by 2050. If 100% of that was cell-based, it wouldn't impact a single livestock producer on the planet. And so I think that, there are opportunities here and that we're going to achieve that in multiple ways. So I guess I'd like to close by saying that we have the best food system in the history of the world, but it's also the worst food system we'll ever have because it's going to get better as we go forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we have some additional time. It's not Sunday, so we can't break for brunch. So if you're thinking about a particular comment or perspective that you'd like to be considered, now is a great time to come on up. You might be on the edge, teetering. Should I offer it? Can I nudge you toward the microphone? There we go. Hopefully he's heading this way, not that way. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Nigel Burrell. I'm an attorney. I'm speaking on my behalf here. On the question of labeling and kind of a statement of identity for these products, I don't think at this stage we should be prescribing a standard or a prescribed nomenclature. I think putting a bunch of people in a room and asking them, whether they're linguists or scientists or marketers, asking them to kind of come up with a new word that people are actually going to use is pretty much impossible. Whatever these products end up being called, I'm pretty sure it's probably going to be something that no one has thought of in this room, no one suggested at this meeting. So as a starting point, I would look at the kind of appropriately descriptive term branch of common or usual names for these products. Perhaps different companies will describe differently what the product is, as long as consumers are aware of the basic nature of these products. That should be fine as a starting point. And then as consumers become familiar with them and perhaps adopt their own term, or perhaps like the Oreo, a certain branded term will kind of take over the entire category as kind of a shorthand for these products, like Xerox or Kleenex, or in some quarters even Coke is kind of shorthand for any soft drink. That could very well happen here. So long story short, I think that developing a standard prematurely for what to call these products is not the way the agency should go. And so that's my comment on the labeling issue. I have formal comments that I'll give later. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think this is a point where we say that no specific mention of a particular brand constitutes an endorsement by the FDA or the USDA. If you are sitting there thinking that, I have a perspective that's a little different from any of those that have been expressed to date, you might seriously considering coming up and offering that perspective. It's important that we hear from a broad range of viewpoints, and we have the time. Or if you're thinking that you might want to get out a little early and give your formal comments this morning instead of this afternoon, that would be fine as well. Great, we have a taker.
Eric Sumption from South Dakota, cattle producer. Just one quick comment. Our industry's taken a lot of heat over hormones, antibiotics, things like that. It comes down to an educational issue with me. Nobody's ever educated me how this process works and what it involves. We talk about consumers. Consumers are very important. If we don't educate them so they understand this product, no matter what we label it, are they really going to interpret what is it? Me as a cattle producer, we've worked a long time to build trust between consumers and stuff like that. That's why I urge these companies or individuals that are doing this technology to maybe step back and educate us so we understand it. It might help us be more accepting to what you want to accomplish. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
My name is Rocky Foreman from South Dakota. I believe that the definition of meat should be restricted to the tissue of animals that are born, raised, and harvested in the traditional manner. I bring two perspectives to the conversation. The first is that as someone who grew up on a ranch in South Dakota and who has worked with family farmers and ranchers throughout my adult career, I've seen firsthand the time and sacrifices producers make to raise safe, high-quality meat for their families and consumers around the world. With each successive generation, these ranching families have worked to improve the sustainability of their operations and the quality and safety of their products. I also bring a unique consumer perspective. As a father, I became increasingly aware of food labeling when my 4-year-old daughter, Maylee, was diagnosed with celiac disease. It became clear to me how important clear, straightforward, and honest food labels are for the health and safety. While proteins produced using animal cell culture technology don't pose the same immediate threat to Maylee's health, there are still many questions about the safety and nutrition of these products. I am confident in the quality, safety, and nutritional value in meat products that derive from the tissue of animals born, raised, and harvested in a traditional manner. I do not have the same confidence in cell culture products and have a right to know the difference when purchasing a product labeled as meat. By law, FDA and the FSIS have a responsibility to implement this standard. The Federal Meat Inspection Act requires FSIS to deem a meat or meat food misbranded if its labeling is false or misleading in any particular. The Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act requires FDA to deem a food misbranded if it is an imitation of another food and is not clearly labeled as such. Family farmers and ranchers take great pride in providing a sustainable, safe, nutritious food supply. With this and any food label, they want to be able to take credit for their hard work. At this time, consumers want to know they are purchasing an authentic, safe, and nutritious product. The bottom line is consumers want to know and producers want to tell them. Thank you.
Thank you. And was that your formal comment? Great, thank you very much.
Hi, this is Sarah Sorsher from CSPI. I had talked enough yesterday. I wasn't planning on giving comments today, but the discussion over standards of identity has been really interesting for me, and I wanted to comment on that. First of all, I'll say CSPI does think that there should be clarity around so that consumers will know whether or not they're eating cell-cultured meat or traditional meat, because some consumers will be seeking this product out and others really would want to avoid it, and they should be able to make that choice. We had always thought of this as something that could be done under the general authority over misleading labeling, either by FDA or USDA. It's interesting to think about applying standards of identity to this. Traditionally, these standards were developed to prevent food fraud, right? So it was about making sure someone couldn't call something butter when it was actually margarine. And here, you sort of want the rule to accomplish both things. You want it to, make sure that people who want to avoid this product can avoid it, but also people who are seeking out can seek it out. So I don't know if it would be like, I don't know what that standard would look like. Would you have a minimum threshold for the percent of the product that had to have cell-cultured meat in it, or would you have a maximum and say that, would you say it had to be called cell-based meat if it had any of this product in it? So I think, in a way, this is a clunky tool for addressing the problem. And also, what would you do about existing standards? Could you call it beef stew if it was cell-based beef stew? So I think maybe USDA needs to look, or FDA, if it ends up being FDA, it needs to look a little bit beyond the standards and develop something that's more comprehensive to address these issues.
Thank you very much. So, again, if there's anyone who has not recognized their point of view being expressed, we're quite happy to entertain additional comments here in this open public forum. Or if you would like to share your formal comments early, we're happy to accommodate that as well. Not seeing much energy here. Like I say, we're a little bit short on brunch opportunities here, so we may make a little change in the program and move the first afternoon set of presentations up to here, unless hearing that inspires someone to come forward with their comments. Otherwise, we're going to continue the session here, but we'll have some additional presentations that were originally scheduled for after lunch. Okay? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Malcolm. And thank you to all our commenters. Certainly this time is for you, and so we don't want to take any of that time away. So I just want everyone to be aware that there are additional opportunities to comment later this afternoon, but let's go ahead and move ahead with the program. So I'm going to ask Geoff Canavan and Dr. Douglas Valentine to come back up. And we're going to move on to the presentations on the regulatory frameworks for food labeling claims. Geoff Canavan is the Deputy Director for Labeling and Program Delivery Staff in the Office of Policy and Program Development at Fsis. And Dr. Valentine, he is the Director of the Office of Nutrition and Food Labeling at CFSAN. And we'll go ahead and get started with Geoff's presentation first.
Thank you. This is a tough time right before lunch, so I'll try and make it interesting. So, okay, if I get my presentation started. Well, as we pull up the presentation, one of the objectives today is I wanted to highlight some of the differences between claims, whether they're regulatory or maybe the subject of a policy, and then also provide some examples of areas where FSIS has developed some regulations and also some policies for the use of various claims. And so some claims are defined in FSIS regulations, and the big one that I think of right off the bat are nutrition related. We have a number of nutrient content claims defined in our regulations relating to good source of nutrients, good source of protein, high fiber, more claims, light, low fat, low cholesterol. These all have very specific regulatory requirements that were established through public notice, comment, and rulemaking. And then there's also claims that are not defined in regulations, and that doesn't automatically mean that they can't be used. It just means that they cannot be misleading. Again, I think you've heard this a number of times today, that all information, especially claims on labeling, need to be truthful and not misleading, and there's specific regulations that address that. And so if there's the opportunity, Matthew mentioned this morning, you provided an overview of the petitions process. Interested parties can petition the agency to develop, make regulatory changes, which can include the development of new claims regarding not only nutrition, but anything related to the meat and poultry. So I mentioned that FSIS, in the absence of a regulation, may publish labeling guidelines, which we have done in the past, and I'll go over a few specifically as examples. But it's really important to note that, and I think you heard this earlier with Doug and myself, is that, you know, the agencies really work closely together. And so you'll see in the development of certain guidelines, we've worked closely with FDA. We've worked closely with the Agricultural Marketing Service on animal production raising claims, and also the Center for Nutrition Policy and Promotion. So we don't develop these guidelines or policies in a vacuum. We're certainly collaborating with other organizations, government agencies. And again, I want to emphasize that consistency with food labeling policies and regulations across all food categories is a very important consideration for the agency. And so here's an example of a policy guide that we developed. We were presented with some labels through a prior label approval system that wanted to make claims, or statements I should say, about the amount of omega-3 fatty acids in a product. And this is not a nutrient that's in the nutrition facts panel. The omega-3s are not specifically called out. So we developed a guideline that explained if the omega-3 fatty acids occurring in the meat were increased through the feed the animal was given, you could make a statement. We would need data that would be submitted with that label application to support the specific level that you're declaring, but also felt that it was important that if the omega-3s are being introduced in a different manner, say through a particular ingredient, that it was important that the consumer know where the source of the omega-3s are coming from. And so that would be a different type of claim, such as X milligrams of omega-3 fatty acids from the fish oil and the breading. And so here's an example of a beef patty product that had a claim. And similarly, we had a guidance document relating to whole grains. We were presented with some labels where a company wanted to make or highlight the fact that the breading in the product had a certain amount of whole grains. And so we were, through the policy development, looking at potential claims, we felt that it could potentially be false and misleading if there was not a significant amount of whole grains in the product. The consumer could potentially be misled into thinking it was there's a significant amount in that product. And so we worked with FDA and CNPP, and in our guideline, we established that to make a statement of this type, it should have a significant amount, which should be at least 8 grams per serving. And so here's an example of a chicken nugget product making such a claim, about 10 grams of whole wheat per serving. And so with these compliance policy guides, the agencies typically will put the guidelines out for 60 days for public comment, so they'll go out in a draft form and then ultimately be published in a final form. Get that next slide. I think my remote's not working here. Oh, here we go. And moving on to other types of claims that are not defined in regulations, there's those called negative claims, and that might sound kind of not right. I mean, how can you make a claim that's negative? But they're negative in the sense that you're highlighting the absence of a particular substance, ingredient, or class of substance, like no preservatives would be a class, or no MSG or no soy. And so through our prior label approval system, we're seeing a significant number of those types of claims on meat and poultry products. Next slide, please. We've also approved statements relating to non-genetically engineered claims. It's another example of a compliance guideline we've published. It's currently in the draft form. We're evaluating the comments. But it establishes the criteria for which FSIS will approve labels for claims of this type. They're required to be under a third-party certification program, and so the claim would consist about the absence of genetically engineered feed in an animal's diet or the absence of genetically engineered ingredients in a product. The claim would also be expected to identify the certifying entity, as well as provide a website so that consumers could obtain additional information on the specific standards that are being applied under the third-party certification program. Next slide. And so here's just an example of a label has multiple claims, raised without antibiotics and added hormones, but it also has an example of a claim about the no GMO feed ingredients, and in this case is using the USDA organic program as the third-party certifying entity. We've also have approved statements about the presence of genetically engineered ingredients. Can be specific to a particular ingredient or more general in cases where one or more genetically engineered ingredients may be used. It may also describe the purpose of use. Another, I think, very good recent example is animal raising claims. We've seen a growth in this area in claims over the last 25 years. Recently published a guideline that described the types of information that would needed to be submitted with the label application to support a particular claim, such as a breed claim, such as Angus, raised without antibiotics, grass-fed, or also under an AMS process verification program. So for most animal production claims, the required documentation, I think it's important to emphasize, as we talk about the types of documentation, that FSIS's jurisdiction starts at the slaughterhouse. So these claims are encompassing a number of raising practices that have occurred outside of our jurisdiction on the farms. So this is why we need additional information, such as a detailed written protocol explaining the controls in place for assuring the production from birth to harvest, and we'll have some examples here in a minute. Signed affidavits declaring the specifics of the animal production claim, how they were, for example, raised without antibiotics, and also tracing and segregation mechanisms. So if you are making a raised without antibiotics claim and you have to treat the animal in event of illness, how are you going to segregate those animals from the herds and to maintain the validity of the labeling claim for the rest of the animals once they're slaughtered? A protocol for the identification, control, segregation of non-conforming animals, that was what we were just talking about. Feed formulations in the case of feed claims, and certainly in third-party certifying verification claims, they're going to need to see a copy of the certificate. And so this compliance policy guideline, we received a lot of feedback from industry, requesting clarification on the types of documentation. So it was published in 2016, and we're currently going through those comments and to publish that in final. So one of the areas that I really wanted to discuss today is the new labeling focus on claims verification. If we go back, rewind to 2010, when we conducted rulemaking to require nutrition labeling on ground, single ingredient products and ground or chopped meat, there was, in that final rule, it talked about how FSIS was going to collect samples of raw ground beef for nutrient analysis and in order to verify compliance with what's being declared on the label. And so the project goal for FSI was to do this surveillance sampling. Again, it's surveillance to get an idea of are the products we sampling in compliance, and determine whether whether the information is accurate or whether further testing is going to be needed. And so one of the criteria for this sampling with our labs is that there had to be consumer-ready packaging, so they could do the analysis and then also compare to what is on the product label of how the product is being marketed in commerce. And so again, this is based on, there was ongoing concern about whether the claims being presented, ensure we have a prior label approval process, but also it helps to have this post-market surveillance activities to determine if these claims are truthful, not misleading, or in the case of nutrition labeling, if what's being stated on the label accurately represents the product. So in 2018, we also expanded the raw ground. We started sampling, and we expanded the raw ground beef sampling, doubling the number of samples analyzed in the laboratory. And as I mentioned earlier, we have seen a growth of the use of certain claims through a prior label approval system, such as no soy, negative claims such as no or raised without antibiotics. So in 2018, we also expanded as part of this laboratory surveillance sampling program to look at raw ground beef products with negative no hormone claims, raw chicken parts with negative no antibiotics claim, and ready-to-eat products with negative and no soy claims. So we'd be looking at continue with our nutritional analysis, but then also looking at other types of claims on these products as well. And again, this was to verify, used as a surveillance mechanism, I should say, to verify industry's compliance with information on the labeling being truthful and not misleading, and also to determine whether the claims were also truthful and not misleading. And thank you.
Good. I think I stand between all you guys and lunch, so I will do my best to talk about claims. I think you'll see there's a lot of commonality between how FDA views claims and FIS has been reviewed some sorts of claims, but there are differences in that FDA doesn't regulate meat, so we don't deal with organic and we don't deal with hormone-free and that sort of thing. But we have a whole variety of other claims, including health claims, that we have to deal with. So I'll spend a little bit of time going over claims from the FDA perspective. The basis of most of the current claims were established in 1990 when the Nutrition Labeling and Education Act was revised, that gave us authority over what we call nutrient content claims and health claims. Informal health claims, and I'll come to it. And then, because of court litigations, we've also then developed the alternative of what are now called qualified health claims, and I'll discuss each of those. There are other truthful and not misleading claims that we look at on food labeling. It could be made with sea salt. It could be something like, made with real maple syrup. It could be something like, vegetables only grown by American farmers, and we would look at each one of those to make sure that in fact it was truthful and not misleading, and that a company manufacturing the product could substantiate that claim was in fact backed up by fact and science. So I'll start with nutrient content claims, and these have been quite popular on packaged food products. They would be something like low in fat, low in saturated fat, low in sodium, sugar-free, high in oat bran, those sorts of nutrient content claims that are high and low in, and they're based predominantly on having a daily value or reference amount that claim would be based on. There also could be terms including free, high, and low. Or comparative claims such as more, reduced, light are nutrient content claims. The regulated term healthy is a nutrient content claim. Or you could have simple amount or percent claims, which would be factual statements that captured the amount of a particular component. I think when we looked at simple amount or percent claims, a little bit like FIS, we would be looking to make sure that the percents that were declared were meaningful in terms of a nutritional and public health context. These are just all of the regulations that provide the detailed regulations that describe these various claims. I won't go through them, but you can see them in the CFR 21. There's an additional claim that was established in NALA, which we'll call FDAMA notifications, and that was a basis that said in some circumstances when an authoritative body, like a Dietary Guidelines Committee or a DRI panel, makes a certain statement, that there is considered to be scientific consensus around those particular statements. And rather than petitioning FDA for the use of those particular claims, we can be informed that based on that authoritative statement that a particular claim, health claim or nutrient content claim, can be justified because there already is general scientific agreement around that particular claim. One comment, and Geoff alluded to it in labeling this morning, is that some products do not require nutritional labeling. But when you begin to make a health claim or a content claim, nutritionally labeling is then required to go along with it. So one of the requirements of doing nutrition-based claims is nutrition facts information must then be provided with it. So the general requirements of nutrient content claims, they're generally based on nutrient levels. They're generally based on what we call racks, so serving sizes from an FDA perspective are reasonable amounts customarily consumed. That's the typical amount that consumers use, and that will be the serving size information that is on nutrition packages today. One of the policy discussions that we've been recently discussing with FIS is that with dual column labeling, what would be the basis of those nutrient content claims on packages now, whether it would be on the larger serving size or the traditional rack, and I think where we believe it should stay with the traditional rack of those particular products. And when there's a nutrient content claim, let's say a good or excellent source of vitamin D or vitamin C or iron or protein, for example, if that particular product contains excessive amounts of sodium, added sugars, or saturated fat, for example, you'll see a disclosure statement that refers the consumer to the nutrition facts panel to make sure that they don't think that a product, just because it has a nutrient content claim on it, is also healthy in all aspects, and to make sure that they're referred to the nutrition facts where they can refer to the content of saturated fat or sodium, for example, in order to make sure the consumer has full information about how to judge how to fit those products into their diets. Nutrient content claim healthy, that's one that's been quite popular on food labels. The original nutrient content claim describing healthy was put into regulation in 1994. It was based on the nutrient content of foods, of providing a meaningful amount of some of the key nutrients in shortfall, but not an excessive amount of sodium, cholesterol, saturated fat, or total fat, for example. As you are aware, we've been revisiting that definition. We held a public meeting last year to get input around redefining the definition of healthy. We also received a citizens petition asking us to consider that definition, and we're currently working on how we might modernize that definition. This just provides some of the background about the comments we got into the public docket. I think it shows the value of public comment. I mean, clearly one of the things that came out of the public comment is a desire for somehow that we take food groups into account and not just nutrients as we consider a modernized or updated definition of healthy, and we're looking at how that may or may not be able to be accomplished within the regulatory framework. But I think those types of comments are quite helpful to us as a regulatory agency as we strive to do that. And the other aspect we're looking at is how could we better make sure that a modern definition of healthy is aligned and consistent with dietary guidelines, and as you know, USDA does a lot of work in terms of education on dietary guidelines. So it's another place where we collaborate with USDA in terms of how can we best make sure that our labeling requirements are also helpful in fostering the goal of getting Americans to build diet patterns that are consistent with our guidelines. Another group of claims that come out of NALA that we as an agency spend a lot of time reviewing because we have statutory authority to approve what are called formal health claims. And these are relationships between a substance in a food or a food and reduced risk of a disease relationship. And that may be in the general population or it could be in a subpopulation. These are risk reduction claims, and they're not claims that talk about the ability of any substance to reduce the risk of a disease or to, its ability to reduce the risk of a disease, but not to treat, prevent, cure, or mitigate an illness. Those are drug territory, not food territories. And like I said, FDA must review and authorize the use of both significant scientific agreement claims and qualified health claims. So the general requirements for these health claims and the petitions that would ask us to consider health claims are in 21 CFR, and it's under 101.14 for those that want to. And we generally spend quite a bit of time consulting with firms that want to submit health claim petitions to make sure that the petitions are robust and based on the best science possible. So, as I said, there are 3 types of health claims that can appear on food packages. The strongest ones are significant scientific agreement claims. These are claims where we believe that the science is the strongest, that really is robust, and that there is general agreement among scientific experts that the relationship between the substance and the disease is supported by strong science. In some cases, as I said, rather than us reviewing the claim, if there is an authoritative statement about a similar relationship, it's called FDAMA, that is another path to having those claims authorized. There are some claims that have been authorized through FDAMA, but they aren't common now. And then we have what are known as qualified health claims, and that is in response to First Amendment considerations in the United States, and that the view that we can't prevent expression of claims that are substantiated by some science, but that we issue enforcement discretion around those claims, and we make sure that we provide appropriate qualification as to the strength of the science that might support that relationship when it does not meet a significant scientific agreement level of scientific evidence. So all health claims that appear have to have some basic facts. They have to have a substance that the claim is based on. That might be a nutrient. It might be a food, but there clearly is a substance. It must be a disease or health-related condition, and the discussion of the relationship between those particular things. I mean, for example, we have claims on the relationship between oat bran and reduced risk of cardiovascular disease based on cholesterol reduction. It's an example of a type of health claim. A labeled health message, there could be health messages, for example, dietary guidance statements or other messages on packages that might be related to health that would be a truthful and not misleading claim on packages, but those sorts of messages cannot relate between a diet and disease relationship. So, for example, talking about the importance of whole grains in healthy diet patterns would be a health type message, but it would not be a health claim. And as with nutrient content claims, there are disqualifying levels for a variety of nutrients where if you exceed those, you are not able to make a health claim, and that's the amount of saturated fat, cholesterol, sodium, and total fat are all factors that we take into account because of the relationship between those dietary components and increased risk of public health. So we put those. The regulation does allow us to give exceptions to some of those claims. So, for example, we have a claim on the relationship between eating certain nuts or olive oil and reduced risk of cardiovascular disease. And those particular nuts and seeds or oils do contain meaningful amounts of saturated fat. So because saturated fat is naturally occurring in those foods, we give an exclusion to the saturated fat content of those, and they can still be authorized to use the claim. And those are examples of that. So I've already talked about significant scientific agreement claims. I won't go over all of them, but currently there are 12 significant scientific agreement claims that we've authorized for use in foods. An example of another one is diets low in saturated fat and cholesterol may reduce the risk of heart disease. That's another example of a significant scientific agreement claim. Another one is low-fat diets rich in fiber-containing grain products, fruits, and vegetables may reduce the risk of some types of cancer. But it gets a little bit qualified because we say a disease is associated with many factors. So that's another example of a type of significant scientific agreement claim. And again, disqualifying nutrient supply. Let's see, I've already, that one. So it seems like I'm going backwards, sorry. Pushing the wrong button. Okay. And I've already talked about FDAMA claims in saying that they are based on authoritative statement. So an example of one of those is diets containing foods that are a good source of potassium and low in sodium may reduce the risk of high blood pressure. That's an example of one of the authorized claims that came from FDAMA. So then I'll come to qualified health claims, and these are the more typical claims that we as an agency are authorizing via enforcement discretion rather than significant scientific agreement claims, simply because the level of evidence for a significant scientific agreement is a very high threshold. So qualified health claims must be supported by scientific evidence, but they're below significant scientific agreement. We authorize them through enforcement discretion letters where we specify specific claim language, and we also qualify the level of scientific support for the relationship of the claim. For example, an example of one would be supportive, but not conclusive evidence or research shows that eating 1.5 ounces per day of walnuts as part of a diet low in saturated fat and low in cholesterol, not resulting in an increase in caloric intake, may reduce the risk of coronary heart disease. And then we say, see nutrition information for fat and calorie content. So it's quite a mouthful, but those are the types of claims that we will consider authorizing under qualified health claim requirements. Other claims and statements can be put on packages so long as they're truthful and not misleading, and I think we heard some comments this morning about production methods. You see claims on packages now that talk about not made with bioengineered foods, so you see some of those particular claims that are used on packages. We have claims around gluten-free, grown on a family-owned farm, for example. So there are a variety of those sorts of claims that can be put on packages that marketeers can do on a voluntary basis, and we judge them based on whether they're truthful and not misleading. And for further information, we have a food labeling guide that really provides a lot more information about claims, so thank you.
Thank you so much. So that does conclude our presentation portion for today, but we will have an opportunity this afternoon to hear from you again, as you can make open public comment, and we will round out the day with a formal public comment session. So right now I think we're going to break for lunch. Let's meet back here at 12:30, and we'll begin the next open public comment session. As a reminder, the USDA cafeteria is in Wing 3, and they do have quite a lunch selection there, so please enjoy yourselves. Thank you.